safely seated on a rolling ship. We really feel like we've made it to the Atlantic now that we're rolling around a bit, and it reminds me of the old Norse sailors saying, "De gunge ut på havet, de gunge så jag går," which means it rolls at sea, and that's why I roll at land. Skål. Some of you have heard it before, I guess. Well, with my aquavit, I'm going to tell you a few more tales today. Oh, my, that Atlantic water is strong. I myself, like an American mongrel, have some Scandinavian blood in me, and especially if you're a sailor, this era of Viking exploration and navigation is very much legendary. And I imagine many of you have traveled to Norway and Sweden and around the Baltic and other islands in the sea that you'd think nobody in their right mind would cross it, especially in an open boat. But of course people did, and the Viking era of exploration was very dramatic. The Viking era is generally referred to when the first Norwegians, Swedish, Danes started to cross the North Sea, famously sacked Lindisfarne in north of England, and then they ravaged the coasts of northern Europe and traveled all around Europe, as was called God Save Us from the Wrath of the Norsemen. And then the period ended at about 1200 when King Olaf began to Christianize his otherwise unruly brethren up in Scandinavia. So I'm going to just show you some of the areas that they traveled, and especially their ships and how they were able to navigate across the sea using fairly rudimentary techniques. Now here's a familiar scene of the Norsemen in their boats, but of course this is the famous Bayeux Tapestry, which in a way is one of the best depictions of how these vessels were manned and operated. Just for your refreshment, the Norman invasion, William the Conqueror, who famously invaded the British Isles, was originally from Norway through a few generations, and so if you have Norman ancestors, that means you also are Vikings, if somewhat better civilized than the original bunch. But here's where they traveled. Back beginning in the 600s and 700s, the various groups from Scandinavia in their boats went all around the north coast of Europe and all the way eventually to take the Kingdom of Sicily was run by Roger from Norway. And then they also, mostly the Swedes, went down the Russian rivers, and the name Russia, meaning reddish, is descended from those red-haired barbarians that came and then conquered the Slavs in the area, where we get the name slaves from. But they also continued down the rivers into the Black Sea and became the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire. So the Viking and the Norse penetration all through Europe was very significant at that time. But I'm not going to go into that detail. I'm talking more about how they got across the larger ocean in very small boats going to places that were yet to be discovered. And specifically after the Viking invasion at the north coast of the British Isles, Scotland, Dublin was founded by Vikings. Then they took Celtic slaves, actually, went to Iceland and then to Greenland and then all the way over to certain parts of North America, where they had settlements for a few hundred years until they all faded out. This was only possible by a certain ability to build and operate these kind of open boats, which were essentially two kinds. This is the Knar, or the fighting vessel, and then this is the Snorri, which is the trading vessel, which is heavier and would carry supplies, which much deeper and slower. The fighting vessels, though, could have up to 50 or 60 men in them and would be oared and sailed, and then they were the assault craft, followed by the trading craft when the settlements were set up around in various parts of Europe and afar. Here's the trading vessel again, which has a fairly simple square rig, not very few oars on board. It was really meant to go slowly, surely, sailing around. But they could still carry quite a bit of goods in the hold, but you note that there's no shelter, and that typically the sailors would be carrying hides and supplies, and at night they would just cover themselves over, and just sort of like you see people on the deck chairs on this ship, they just sort of covered them over in the midst of the storms and the gales. Doesn't matter as long as you can get a nice cup of tea, which was not true on Viking vessels. They had aquavit and other strong spirits. Now, if you go to Oslo to the Viking Ship Museum, you can see the examples of this that have been unearthed in funereal remains from different parts of the fjords of Oslo. And this is a lapstrake style construction with a very high prow. And they're very dramatic. Some of them are, these boats that they took out were decorated and very much ornamental, but they were certainly built in the same style as the ones that went to sea. The fighting boats, though, had this great prow, which was in a sense not quite a ramming prow like you get on the Mediterranean galleys, but it provided a bit of shelter and also something to take over when there was hand-to-hand fighting and provide the assault forces some protection. They were very large. Some of them were up to about 60 feet long, and then would be manned by so many warriors who would go out. Now, these were, as someone said, this was the summer vacation for Viking men. They would go off to sea on adventuring, and so they get home, and the wife and the family who were taking care of the farm back in Norway said, well, how was your summer vacation, dear? He said, oh, the same old raping and pillaging. I'm so glad to be home. Well, they went far and wide, often with the winds, but if they needed to, and especially if they got into the bays and the rivers, they would row. And the name actually Viking, Vik is a bay. So these were the bay-able sailors who would then extend themselves out to sea. And the oars were like this, put in, they have a cover when there was rough seas and they were sailing. Then the boats were also able to actually be picked up and hauled over ground, which meant that they were very able to penetrate all the rivers, go over shoals, go over lands, portage in places, and that's how they got so far with an open boat at sea, and then it quickly turned into a river boat, and they were able to go all through the whole European and then to the America sides of the world. Now here's another view of the Bayeux Tapestry showing them making the boats. Now this is a ancient art, how you put together a boat with timber, usually oak and pine, different combinations. Here's one of the preserved boats on the museum. And this is considered to be the origin of any modern wooden shipbuilding. A keel was laid. Now this was essentially the backbone of a boat to this day, a wooden boat. And then the strakes would be put on, and the bow and the stern stem would be built. Now there's quite a few recreations of this in wooden boat schools that are building these to pass on the skill. So they've returned to some of the traditional techniques of quarter sawn planks, such that the heart of the wood is strong right at that tip. And then this is a knee, usually an oak knee, that then is used to attach to. Then they had copper rivets that they would pound and then use a caulking, a fibrous caulking with wax to seal the boat, but they were somewhat flexible. This meant that in a sea they were not so rigid as to break. They would heave with the sea action and be still watertight. Here's some of the copper rivets that have been excavated in some of the archaeological sites. And then there's the great bow stem and stern stems, which are one solid piece that would bind the bow and the stem together. And I was just rebuilding a boat where we did rebuild a bow stem in the Old Norse style so that it would be a strong buttress against the sea. Then they had different levels for the rowers, depending on the size of the vessel. But it was a fairly common and a simple boat to make, and they're, again, making more of these days, and almost every town in Scandinavia seems to have one these days. And they have launched quite a few that have crossed the Atlantic again as a recreation of these epic voyages of once upon a time. And so then the question came is, how did they really know how they were going anywhere? If they had these vessels that were so capable, it must have been matched by some knowledge of navigation that would make an ocean voyage predictable and successful. So here's a recreated voyage with its stone ballast, and they're raising the rigging. And again, in many Scandinavian ports and also the Ireland, British Isles, you can see versions that have come from that tradition. Here is a double ender that's called, with a tiller, but in this case it has a modern stern post of a rudder. The earlier steering boards were always on the steering side, which we have as our heritage. Why we call this the right-hand side of a vessel starboard is because that's where the big steering board traditionally was. And so this was a paddle that would be mounted on its side post like this, and then have a tiller that was perpendicular to the length of the boat, unlike a hung rudder, which would be in line with the boat. So this must have been a very arduous task to be able to steer that. If they were under sail, though, they could pick the whole thing up and take it out of the water and just steer by handling the great sail. So this has been rebuilt, and it is functional, but it is certainly an antique form of steering a boat. And of course, this great ship has completely different methods for its steering. Here's a couple of the old stone anchors, wooden, and then they started, when they got enough iron smelting, it was made in Sweden originally, the first iron anchors were built. And then this device down here is a baler, a wooden scoop baler, and you can still buy in Norway the same exact baler for your small craft today, carved out of a piece of wood. Now these, the Kanar, the fighting vessels were, as I said, very shallow, and they had the ability to go right up on a beach. So this is where the Vikings were the great terror of northern Europe and the Mediterranean, because they would appear sailing over the horizon, suddenly arrive, come up a river, come into a bay. They could land anywhere, and they would jump out and then have their way speaking with the locals, negotiating a truce, hopefully. But the shock troops they were called the berserkers, and that is an Old Norse saying for the bear shirts. And they had this bear skin, which was fairly impermeable to glancing blows of weapons, but it was the berserkers who went ashore first, just like some people on board this ship when they're eager to go on tour. They seem to go a little berserk on the gangway. They want to get to the bus. That's the old Viking tradition of being the first ashore. Now here's, again, a couple of the recreated boats, this one in Iceland. And they, of course, there were many thousands of these vessels that were traveling all around. But in the shallow waters, local waters, you would row or you'd have a sail. But in the open waters, you had to be very capable to handle this kind of a rig. Now, these were wooden spars and mast. Here's a cradle for it, and then the lashings. And this is recreated with stronger, perhaps synthetic ropes these days. The sails were made of what's called varmur, which was a kind of a wool that was woven, and it had a lot of lanolin in it. And it was very heavy, but it also was so strong it could hold up in the rough winds and the seas. Linen or canvas sails are not nearly as strong as this, but these were very, very heavy to handle. Here's one that is being tested out on a recreated boat. The shields are a tradition for protection, but your typical Viking cartoon always has them out there, whether or not all boats had them. But still, that was a bit of protection in the battles that came. Here's a vessel out underway in the sea, and you can see it's a one single yard arm with a square sail. But if it is handled properly, it can sail somewhat to windward. Here, if you take the leading edge of the sail and you tie it hard to the bow, you will get a upwind aspect. It may only be sailing up 40 degrees off the wind, which is not as high as any modern triangular sails or lateen style, but nonetheless, they could make their way upwind, if not very high upwind. And so these were fairly good sailing boats that could then get up and around all these places, and especially the Norwegian coast is very rough with the great maelstrom off the Lofoten Islands. And if you've sailed up that stretch of the ocean, especially when it's not a nice summer day, it's very rough with a lot of dangers like our kraken friends and other demons of the sea that certainly had their way with many sailors. And of course, going back a few 100 million years ago, there really were some big sea monsters out there there may be a few left in a few locks here and there. And so that many, imagine how many Norse sailors were lost trying to find their way to the next island, around to the next fjord. And so there's a lot of mythology about how sailors would be drowned and met with various monsters. And if they were lucky, they'd get a good life-saving service like my friend that I always travel with. Well, then the Norwegians, of course, were perhaps the most adventuresome of them all. I mean, the Swedes mostly went into Central Europe, and the Danes, of course, came and conquered Britain at a certain time. But this gentleman, Rollo of Olesen, famously went down to the coast of France and then took his boats up the rivers of France, and particularly the Seine, and then besieged Paris. And Charles the Bald made a deal with Rollo and his subsequent ancestors that if they would leave Paris alone, they would give them the coastal area, which comes to us now as Normandy. And that's where the Normans were settled by Rollo and his antecedents or descendants from Norway, and then became the Normans as we know them. And then others continued on to the other isles. Eric the Red was born in Ireland, but then he traveled to Iceland. And at a certain point, he had a dispute and he murdered somebody, and his punishment was banishment rather than being thrown off the rocks here near Reykjavik. And so he set up with his family an expedition, a number of vessels, some 20 more vessels, and he had heard that there was more land to the west. So he took his clan, and they were the first to settle in Greenland. And so they came around into the great fjordlands of southern Greenland and came and set up the settlements, the eastern and western settlements on the west coast and southern tip of Greenland. And if you've ever been through here, this is one of the greatest sea passages anywhere, because it's a tremendous fjord with glaciers hanging above and the rough seas outside and a lot of icebergs in the area. But it's a passage called a King Christiansen Sound through the tip of Greenland. And then you come around to more sheltered waters on the west coast of Greenland, where they have found the settlements of Eric the Red and the other Norse settlers at the time. And they've excavated the iron tools and some of the remains of the old sod houses. But then Eric the Red's son, Leif, continued this family tradition of being kicked out of one island and to go find another one. And so he was the first to cross from Greenland to the unknown shores of North America. And you see him steering his vessel, pointing out in the fog, saying, "I know there's something out there," just like they're doing on the bridge today. We know that there's something out there. We can hear the echo of the foghorn. Well, these were very brave sailors, certainly, out in an open boat in waters like this. But they did come to various places in the sagas. It said they got to Helgeland and Markland and Vinland, and then maybe even down to New York. Who knows? The scholars have been trying to identify where these places actually are. It's most likely they were on the coast of Labrador, Newfoundland, and then perhaps they went down to the sandy shores of Vinland, which some people say is maybe Martha's Vineyard, Cape Cod area. But they were repulsed by what they call the Skreklings, which were the savages. And they had settlements that did not survive, either because of the harsh winter, lack of supplies, even though they were very hardy people who would traditionally build a sod home. And this was true back in Norway, all through Scandinavia, and then into the New World. And this is in Newfoundland at Meadow de Lance, where they found the proof that there were Norse settlements there back in the late 900s, and they died out within a century or more. Now, this particular kind of sod house is interesting because it will survive and keep you warm through a harsh winter. There'd be fires inside, and then communal sleeping areas, and then some animals, and it's like a one big communal home that has doorways, but that's called the eye of the wind, which was to let the smoke out, but it comes down in English to our day as the window, or the eye of the wind in Old Norse. But again, how did they get there? Well, this has been reconstructed by a number of scholars, that if you take the Old Norse names for the cardinal points, there are descriptions of how you follow your way to one island after the other, and you can cross the seas mainly by latitude sailing, so that if you sight a star or sun, you can then, with a kind of a pegboard, they would hold that course on their vessel. Even on a rolling sea, it would be a very crude kind of a compass. It's not magnetic, it is just a sighting compass, it's called. And then they would have this kind of a device, which would be a floating compass, sun compass, which again, if it's a calm day, you can get a declination of the sun at sunrise or sunset or noon to help determine your latitude. And, or else they would take this ashore where it would be stable, and they would sit and watch it when the weather would clear. Then they could tell their latitude by that shadow of the pole. Now, this is a very ancient technique. It was also used in Asia by the Chinese. But in this case, out on a boat, if you had that sighting of the sun and a measure of its angle, you would have a rough idea how far north and south you were. You would compare that to the prevailing winds. You could also read the wave swells. You would have a sense of direction because of currents you knew, or else storms would be somewhere that would give a wave pattern. You can see this off the ship just today. There are swells that are coming from weather patterns, and that'll give you an indication of direction. You can just take a course and keep the waves off of your certain angle of your bow. But in the, of course, the north latitudes, sunlight is somewhat rare at certain times of year, as you may have noticed in your own garden. And this is just an illustration how the only time when you have enough sunlight to really sail is from about May to through July, when you'll have a full, farther north you go, you'll have a full midnight sun. But in the wintertime, it's so dark that you have only the briefest time to even see where you are. So the Vikings are certainly summer sailors like most of us are to this day. If you go to the farthest north, the sun is so a much better indicator than magnetic compasses that once you've gone up to the highest latitudes, you don't use a magnetic compass at all. And this is a modern solar compass, which is used for polar navigation these days. Well, so here's an example of how they might have crossed by latitude. Now, this is a Mercator projection, so it's these lines should actually be curved as we take a great circle arc on this ship. But if you leave from, let's say, Bergen, if you stay on that latitude, you will arrive at a certain point in Greenland. And so this was very well known by the Norse sailors, that if they left from a certain point and they kept their latitude bearing, they would then land at a predictable place. There must have been a lot of trial and error on this. This is more, let's say, accurate of what it is really like. So if you leave Bergen here, you will end up at Kap Farvel. If you go, let's say, from a higher port, you'd end up in Iceland. And of course, to go down to the coast of Northern Europe and the British Isles, that was mostly coastal pilotage, and that was not such a long way. Fortunately, there are a few other little islands, the Faroe Islands and the Shetland Islands, and places to stop and visit on the way if you're in a long voyage. It would take a month to 2 months to cross the sea in the good season. But it was all very much dependent upon the ability to judge your latitude. Now, there was no good measure of longitude back then, but if a sailor at night in a clear sky could very easily get their latitude by seeing the Polaris, the pole star, which is the due north indication on the northern hemisphere. And then if they also had what's called a zenith star, depending on the time of year, at a certain latitude, there will be a star that will rise on the horizon and then stand directly above you in the zenith of the sky at a certain time of night, and then it'll drop into the horizon as the dawn comes. But by sighting both the Polaris and that zenith star, that would give a very accurate latitude judgment of how north and south the course of the vessel is. And they had on the gunnels of the old open boats marking boards that they would use to sight the rising star and also the sun at certain points along their voyage, so they could tell if they were off course. They could readjust that and get back on course. In Greenland in 1948, at one of these archaeological sites, a stone fragment was found which is believed to be a training device that was used to train some of the young navigators. Now you can imagine a people who live by the sea and travel to faraway settlements. The importance of the navigator was paramount. And so they had rudimentary training ashore, such that we think that that stone was actually a kind of a compass point that would then be part of a larger training facility where they would have, well, first of all, the boats to practice, train the youth how to handle them, but they would use it also for astronomical viewing, something perhaps like Stonehenge or other sites around the world where astronomy was trained on a circular pattern and the heavenly bodies and the seasons were very carefully measured. And then this one stone and another one that was found, the Sunstone, were considered to be maps that would be used for sighting at a certain time and then training the young navigators what they should look for. Now this stone probably was put on a pole and then rotated, and it's very much worn after 1,000 years in the ground, but it's been studied as a possible navigation training tool. And then one scholar superimposed what he feels were the carvings of all of the surrounding lands. And so this being Greenland right here, that's the center, and they would turn this to point to various stars and the sun rising so that they would learn on land how to get back and go here all the way down to the shores of North America. Also, here we are. This is certainly Labrador, and this may be Newfoundland, which of course is this tremendous many-fingered island, and then Nova Scotia and other parts that they may have also traveled to. But in the foggy dew out here in the North Atlantic, the real problem is that, well, that's very fine if you know celestial navigation, but what happens if you're out there for weeks on end in weather like we have today? Well, this puzzled many a marine historian, wondering what they were using to continue on their way, because it's very easy to get turned around by a storm and have no idea where you're going. Again, in digging in some of these archaeological sites, this was found, which is called the Sunstone. And it's made out of a kind of a quartzite, which has a polarizing effect. And as seen in the bucket, that's a piece of polarizing glass. But this crystal, there was some in Norway, but it was they found quite a bit of it and quarried out of a certain part of eastern Iceland. And it's thought that this was held by the navigator on board, the skipper, to sight the sun on a cloudy day. Now this crystal will be clove and it'll always break at that angle, 11.5 degrees, such that it's a sort of trapezoidal shape. But it has the quality, if you put a dot of ink on it, or two of them, and if you align it to where the sun is, they will join and give an indication of where the sun is even on a cloudy day. And so this is considered what they used out there in the middle of otherwise inclement weather. They could use the sunstone to get a very rough indication of where the sun is at sunrise and thereby be on their course. So if you line that up with the solar compass and you have this polarizing stone, then you are in knowledge of where you're supposed to be going. Well, that may have been their real trick secret, how they could really get across the seas. This is not used by any other peoples that I've ever heard of around the world. Then this knowledge was perhaps secret. The North American and the Greenland settlements certainly died out, but the question is whether this information got back to Scandinavia and then came to the rest of the world belatedly. Now this map was found by a collector in a library and is now at Yale University in Connecticut in the U.S., and it has been debated whether this is the proof of the continuance of knowledge, at least among Scandinavians, that they had settled these faraway places before Columbus and the rest of Europe knew about the Americas. Others have said it's probably a fraud, and it can't really be proven until the map is given its carbon dating, which I have not read that they've done. So it's considered either proof or disproof of all of the possibilities that the Norse had settled that far. Well, I'm going to go into some more recent history of Scandinavians who are out in the northern waters. Here's a map from Norway and Bergen, which shows the frozen sea, the Mare Glacial, and then this is Greenland Iceland, Faroe Islands, of course here's the British Isles and Ireland, and then the Skraeling land, which is the land of the savages, Markland, Hololand, and now this was certainly after everyone knew of those places, but this was considered to be, let's say, the North Seas that were there to be settled by Scandinavians, and of course the Danes and others have continued to come to North America, and particularly Greenland became part of the Kingdom of Denmark. This man, Hans Egede, was the missionary bishop of all of Greenland for many years and spent his life trying to convert the Inuit and set up a number of the settlements which remain to this day, though if you've been there recently, the Danish names are being rewritten into the native language these days. And then there was the great polar ice area, which was very foreboding, certainly for, in the days of the Vikings, they may have gone up and turned right around because there was no possibility of living up there. But the continuance of this Norse exploration has certainly continued up with the great explorers in our recent history, particularly Fridtjof Nansen, who famously took his ship and then drove it into the ice and was swept around the Arctic in the moving ice flow and proved that it is a moving sea of ice and not a continent up there. And then he was later, of course, a great leader in the independence of Norway. That ship, the Fram, is at the Fram Museum in Oslo if you want to go see it. And then there were other great adventurers like Raoul Amundsen, who went to the North Pole, then he also was the first to the South Pole, and was part of the great polar race at the turn of the last century. And then the tradition has gone on with other Scandinavians like Thor Heyerdahl, who was the famous adventurer who tried to prove that prehistoric peoples and simple technology could have led various parts of the world to travel and other peoples to travel across the seas. Famously, his Kon-Tiki expedition to try to prove that South American natives went and sailed to Polynesia. Well, he was successful in that raft journey from Peru to Polynesia, but it's more likely that the Polynesians actually came from the Great West and settled from west to east, not the way that Thor Heyerdahl proposed. Though he does have a museum of exploration that's in Waterford, Connecticut, if you want to go see a full display of his different expeditions. He preferred tropical waters, not surprisingly, though. And then the Great North is the subject of much study nowadays because of the melting of the ice cap and then the opening up of the great Arctic Ocean to whatever it will be if it does become ice-free. And that's of great importance to the climate of the northern hemisphere of the whole planet. And so even to this day, there are quite a few scientific outposts in this otherwise very foreboding sea that may have once had Vikings visit, but they are all now mostly uninhabited islands. This one, Jan Mayen, is a Norwegian island that is off the north of Iceland, off the east coast of Greenland, and is home to the largest volcano in the Atlantic. And it is fortunately quiet, at least as of the last few days, but it is one of the great volcanoes sitting on the great mid-Atlantic ridge that is volcanically active, as we have recently found out. Now here's another Norwegian who was famously the first man to ski across the Arctic ice cap and lived to tell about it. And then another Norwegian skier, this is Liv Agnesson, was the first woman with her colleague Anne Bancroft to ski across Antarctica. So they may not be sailors, but they very much continue in the great tradition of exploration that the Vikings were the initiators of. And then now we're out in space, and this woman, Kathy Sullivan, who was part Norwegian, Irish name, but she was one of the astronauts in the space shuttle, and she took this picture of the Lofoten Island in the peninsula in Norway. And she's also been a guest speaker on this ship when she's not on another ship. And of course, the mythology of the Viking era goes on into the mythology of our current era, and so Leif Erikson, as one of those iconic names of exploration, has been well marketed if you believe in the future of space travel. But these original ships were so sturdy and they were able to cross these rough seas and, let's say, open up a new chapter in human history, even if their settlements faded for a while, but that spirit definitely goes on to the present. And so I mentioned the other day my friend Reed Stowe, who's out on the world's longest journey at sea for 3 years, over 1,000 days. He's over about 1,400 days actually now. And so even though he's not discovering a new land, he's certainly out there in almost an open boat and adventuring in that spirit of sea voyaging. And so I'm going to leave you with this last image of a Viking vessel, and I'm going to just say that there are many spirits out in the ocean of many other sailors, and particularly those adventurers who may not have come back after their exploration. And it just reminded me of a song, an old Norse song, which is usually a lament for your sailors who are off to Valhalla or elsewhere, which goes, Vem kan segler utan vind, and vem kan rår utan år, and vem kan lämna vänner sin utan fjällen tårar. Who can sail without wind, and who can row without oars? And who can leave their dear friend without tears falling? Well, jag ska segla utan vind, and jag ska rora utan år. Men hur kan jag lämna du mina vän utan fjällen tårar? Well, I will sail without wind, and I will row without oars, but I will never leave you, my friend, without tears falling. With that, thank you very much. Skål. Thank you.